The EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network presents Vatican Insider with Joan Lewis. Each week, Joan brings you news from inside the Vatican and the Church around the world, as well as interviews and answers to your questions. Now, here's the host of Vatican Insider, Joan Lewis.
Welcome to Vatican Insider on another exciting Jubilee weekend in a very hot Rome. The Jubilee of Sports, with a lot of events on the agenda, including the Mass on Sunday the 15th, celebrated by Pope Leo XIV, a pope who likes sports and has played tennis and is a fan of his native Chicago's baseball team, the White Sox. In fact, he was given a White Sox baseball cap at the Wednesday general audience and wore it briefly, sporting a broad smile. The interview segment features Catherine Wiley and Marilyn Henry of the Catholic Grandparents Association as we talk about the first international conference that CGA recently held in Rocca di Papa near Rome. Catherine is the founder and president of CGA, and Marilyn is the delegate for the U.S. and works with other CGA groups internationally. CGA grandparents from Ireland, England, Australia, the U.S., Malta, Gibraltar, and the Philippines were among those attending the conference. That fascinating conversation comes after the news. So now, some news headline. Sunday, June 8th, Pentecost Sunday. Under a scorching sun with temperatures in the high 80s, 80,000 faithful attended Mass, presided over by Pope Leo, who celebrated with 42 cardinals, 200 bishops, and 250 priests, all wearing red vestments symbolizing the Holy Spirit descending as tongues of fire. Quoting the late Pope Benedict's words in a 2005 Pentecost homily, "The Spirit opens borders," Leo said the Spirit indeed opens borders, first of all in our hearts. Where there is love, there is no room for prejudice, for security zones separating us from our neighbors, for the exclusionary mindset that tragically we now see emerging also in political nationalisms. He stressed how the Holy Spirit worked something extraordinary in the apostles' lives, noting, quote, "What happened in the upper room happens again today. The Holy Spirit comes like wind, like fire, surprising and illuminating us." And by the way, folks, wind was very much a protagonist at the Saturday Vigil and Sunday Pentecost Mass. Monday, June 9th. As the Church marked the Jubilee of the Holy See on the liturgical memorial of Mary, Mother of the Church, Leo XIV spent the morning with employees and officials of the Roman Curia. Following a meditation in the Paul VI Hall, Leo, carrying a Jubilee cross, led a procession of Holy See officials to and through the Holy Door of St. Peter's Basilica, where he then celebrated Mass. "The Holy See lives in a most particular way," he said, "the co-presence of two poles, Marian and Petrine. It is the Marian one that ensures the fruitfulness and holiness of the Petrine one, through her motherhood, gift of Christ and the Holy Spirit. This fruitfulness of Mary and of the Church is inseparably linked to her holiness, and that is her conformity to Christ," said the Pope. "The Holy See is holy as the Church is holy, in her original core, in the fabric from which she is woven." Tuesday, June 10th. At a meeting with apostolic nuncios and other papal representatives posted throughout the world, Pope Leo XIV said papal representatives are an image of the Catholic Church and her universality, because they hail from many nations and represent the Pope throughout the world. The diplomacy of the Holy See constitutes, in its very personnel, a model, certainly not perfect, said the Pope, but very significant, of the message it proposes, namely that of human fraternity and peace among peoples. Speaking off the cuff, the Pope said the ministry of pontifical representatives is, quote, "irreplaceable," adding that their assistance in choosing candidates for the episcopate is truly essential. In his prepared remarks, Pope Leo expressed his gratitude for their service as he takes the first steps of his Petrine ministry, saying he especially appreciates their expertise in understanding issues and situations related to any given country. Wednesday, June 11th. At the general audience in a very hot, sun-splashed St. Peter's Square, Pope Leo focused on Jesus' miracles of healing, starting with the story of the blind beggar Bartimaeus, who, he said, cries out to Jesus with a plea that in itself is an act of faith. Jesus, have mercy on me. When Jesus asks Bartimaeus to come to him, the blind beggar immediately throws off his cloak, his one possession and the sole source of his security. Leo said Bartimaeus thus stands before Jesus in all his vulnerability, trusting in the Lord's power to restore his sight. We too, said the Pope, recognizing our own need for healing, are asked to come to the Lord in all our frailty, leaving behind our own cloaks, our securities, our comfort zones, in order to experience his healing power. During this Jubilee of Hope, said Leo, may we too receive the grace to see all things anew in the light of faith and to follow the Lord in freedom and newness of life. Later, Pope Leo, turning to the school shooting in Austria that killed 10, said, I would like to assure my prayers for the victims of the tragedy that took place in the school in Graz. I'm close to the families, teachers, and schoolmates. May the Lord receive these children of his in his peace. Thursday, June 12th. Welcoming the priests, deacons, and seminarians of Rome to the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV applauded them for their faith and service and urged them to love the Church. He told them, you are all precious in the eyes of God and in the realization of his plan. I thank you for your lives given in service to the kingdom, for your daily labors, for so much generosity in the exercise of the ministry, for all that you live in silence, and that at times is accompanied by suffering or misunderstanding. Leo added, I would like to help you, to walk with you, so that each one may regain serenity in his ministry. But precisely for this, I ask you for a renewed effort in priestly fraternity, which is rooted in a solid spiritual life, in the encounter with the Lord and listening to his word. And with a heartfelt plea, Leo said, I ask you this with the heart of a father and a pastor. Let us all commit to being credible and exemplary priests. Also Thursday, in a telegram sent in his name by Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin, Pope Leo expressed his condolences and prayers for the victims of an Air India flight bound for London with 242 people aboard that crashed after takeoff in the Indian city of Ahmedabad. There was only one survivor. Friday, June 13th. Pope Leo XIV presided at an ordinary public consistory for a vote on causes for canonization, where formal approval for the canonization of 8 blesseds was given and the dates set for their canonizations. The Pope announced that Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati and Blessed Carlo Acutis will be canonized together on September 7th. The canonizations of the 2 young saints, one from the early 20th century and the other the first 21st century saint, have been greatly anticipated due to the great devotion among the faithful. Well, those are the week's top stories. Now, stay here for a fascinating conversation with 2 amazing women who organized the first international meeting of the Catholic Grandparents Association.
EWTN, Teaching the Truth.
I would like to thank you because I look up to you. I love EWTN. I have one of the rarest diseases in the world. And when I can't go to church, which I go pretty much every day, I go right on to EWTN.
Having a mother figure like Mother Angelica really impacted my life.
I'm a listener to you guys for the longest time. You guys helped me and help, I'm sure, everybody so much.
This is a Messy Family Minute with Mike and Alicia Hernan. 3 years ago, we became grandparents, and it's just as wonderful as everyone told us it would be. We are blessed to have the love of 5 grandchildren, and we look forward to many more.
Grandparents are a blessing to children because they have a different perspective on life in general. We can usually see the problems that toddlers or teenagers have with different eyes than their parents. We have more time to pray for them and more time to serve. Our very lives dedicated to God and to our vocation is a witness to the joy of living the gospel. But what is the role of a grandparent in the life of a grandchild?
The best thing a grandparent can do is boldly love. Love your grandchildren deeply, and by doing so, you will be an image of God's love for them. Love your adult children by supporting them, even if they choose to raise their children differently than you raised them. Parents are the most powerful influence in the life of a child, and you, as a grandparent, need to build up that relationship between your child and your grandchild. For more inspiration and encouragement, visit us at messyfamilyminute.org.
Welcome back to Vatican Insider. Here's Joan Lewis.
Well, this is a very unusual interview segment this weekend on Vatican Insider because I am taping my guests at 3 different times. I was recently in Rocca di Papa outside of Rome for a wonderful conference, the first international conference for Catholic grandparents and the elderly. And you know Catherine Wiley and you know Marilyn Henry because Catherine, of course, founded Catholic Grandparents. We've done shows before talking about their mission, their work, and all the various countries. But this time, we're going to talk more about the conference that we attended that they've set up in Rocca di Papa. And my 2 other guests, and they were taped at different times, 2 of the prominent guests at the conference were Cardinal Wilfred Napier. He's the Archbishop Emeritus of Durban, South Africa, and also Archbishop Gilbert Garcera of the Philippines. So it was really a star-studded crowd, not only the CGA people from around the world, but our guest speakers. So we're going to start. We're in my home in Rome with Catherine and Marilyn, so we're going to start talking about that. And Catherine, first of all, just kind of summarize for anybody who might be tuning in for the first time what the Catholic Grandparents Association is, why you wanted to found it.
Well, first of all, Joan, before I go 1 second further, I have to say thank you to you. Because you were with us. You know, you came out to Villa Palazzola and you stayed with us for 2 full days. And you were like a bright light. You never stopped smiling, and you were so interested, Joan, in the grandparents from all over the world and what they had to say, and in the speakers. You know, you just mentioned we had Cardinal Napier from South Africa, who we've known since 2012. I met him at the Eucharistic Congress. We had Archbishop Gilbert Garcera, who started the Catholic Grandparents Association after we met at the World Meeting of Families in Milan. And of course, they have an enormous Catholic Grandparents Association established in the Philippines. Then we had Gabrielle Gambino, who is the Undersecretary for the Dicastery for Marriage and Family. And then we had Vittorio Scalzo, who is the Secretary for the Elderly at the Dicastery for Marriage and Family. Plus we had Professor Keith Chappell from the Maryvale Institute, and all the incredible grandparents who joined with us. You know, we've had Zooms, we've talked.
Sure, the cafes.
Faith Cafe, and we've never managed, many of us, never met face to face. So they were all there to share the mission and the joy of the mission.
Sure.
With which the purpose, the only purpose and mission of the Catholic Grandparents Association is to help grandparents to pass on the faith.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, this was the 25th Jubilee, believe it or not, of the Catholic Grandparents Association, since we first started as a simple pilgrimage at the Shrine of Our Lady in Walsingham. And again, I know we talked to you before many times, Joan, but people seem to forget that, or might forget that, the inspiration for the Grandparents Association came through the grandparents of our Holy Mother.
Sure, Joaquin and Anne.
Yes, and again, very few people talk or know about the grandparents of Jesus. They still say, what? Jesus had grandparents? So on that day, on the 8th of September, Our Lady's birthday, at Mass in the Stripper Chapel in Walsingham, I was wondering what we could give Our Lady for a birthday present. And people call that praying, but I was just wondering, and the idea came very, very clear. People call it a revelation, that a pilgrimage to honour St. Joachim and St. Anne, her mother and father and the grandparents of Jesus, would truly delight her. And so we started. And in a nutshell, that's how the Catholic Grandparents Association came into being.
And this ended up because of your determination, your absolute love. You had to have a Grandparents' Day. a World Day for Grandparents and the Elderly. And the Vatican, under Pope Francis, and meeting with you a number of times, and all the work you and Marilyn have done and everything, finally, in July 2021, we had the first World Day for Grandparents. And it's every July because it's near the birthday of the grandparents of Jesus, So, yeah. So the conference, that is very exciting. And for you too, Marilyn, because yes. Your work in the U.S. and with other at the international level, this has to be so exciting to have this World Day. You've been with Catherine. You guys have just done this together for so many years. Now, what were some of the countries that were at the conference?
Philippines, yeah. Australia, England, Ireland, the U.S. I'm missing some.
Malta,
South Africa,
Gibraltar,
South
yeah.
Africa,
yeah. Sure.
England.
Yeah.
Just amazing times.
Huge number from America.
And the U.S.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. We were an exuberant crowd.
And basically every day, in addition to guest speakers, and we've mentioned the Cardinal, we've mentioned Archbishop Gilbert, but in addition to them, it was the people from the different countries giving reports on how they set things up. And I think there was one, correct me if I'm wrong, one gal got up, she was from North Carolina, and she said, I really don't know what to say, I'm just setting it up. Yes. But she said she's going home inspired.
That's right.
Because all of you who got up talking about the good and the bad, not the bad, but I mean the problems that one faces anytime. Challenges, anytime you set up anything that's new.
Yes.
And so she's going to go home heartened and
so some of our ministries have been going for 20 years, almost, since the beginning of the CGA, and some, like Kathy, I think hers is maybe a year old, maybe a little bit more than a year old, so she's just getting started. But you saw her, and you saw the light that she showed,
yes.
and how excited she is.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yes, she just was exuding joy at having all this help that she got from everybody without knowing, or maybe she suspected she was going to be getting help at this kind of conference.
Joan, I think that one of the difficulties is that when you don't meet each other, when you don't have that personal contact, I mean, there's nothing better than a personal relationship, sitting down like we are now,
sure.
eyeball to eyeball, talking about something. And you can feel very isolated and lonely when you're working like that. You don't believe that there are other people who share the same passion. And the reason that everybody came together, it was very interesting. When all the different countries, when we had their feedback, what was the main thing they wanted to do was to pass on the faith to their grandchildren, because they thought in many ways that we were failing and our confidence had been shattered. And that's why, nearly 20 years ago, we wrote to Pope Benedict and we asked him to write a prayer for grandparents. Yes. To help us and support us. And Joan, nobody ever believed he would write that prayer. And so our mission was to ensure that our Holy Father saw the request, Pope Benedict, and we made sure that he did, because grandparents are very determined, particularly when it comes to our grandchildren. And he did. He wrote the prayer, and it was that prayer that started the Catholic Grandparents Association. And that was a very, very important lead-up.
Sure.
Because it was really the instrument of evangelization that started the association. And one of the things that Cardinal Napier said when he gave his speech was encouragement and hope for the grandparents and the elderly. And he said, why are we here? He asked the question. And he said, to make a real impact on those who may be more open to hearing the message of Christ from us than they may be from their own parents. And that's very true.
Absolutely.
Grandparents can have a much better relationship with their grandchildren.
And, it was interesting talking to Archbishop Gilbert of the Philippines, and we must say there also was a priest with us who is a grandfather.
Yes, that's right.
He had a wonderful story, married and children, and then widowed, and he had always had this attraction just to the priesthood, and that's what he, is now, but a priest who is a grandfather was wonderful. But I also loved, I think it was the last lunch that I was seated across from Archbishop Garcera of the Philippines, kind of evaluating the conference and everything. And I said, what do you see as a big challenge, or what has to change? And he surprised me for a minute, because he said attitudes. And I thought, what's he talking about? He meant the attitudes of society. Yes. Looking at the elderly, looking at grandparents as a generation that's finished. they're no longer maybe viable members of the working world or something like that. But they're dignified, wonderful human beings with great wisdom and with a huge depth and breadth of experience. Just look at yourself. So,
I think that as Gabrielle Gambino said, what did she say? Let me see if I can find it. Old age is not an age of decline, but a time of extraordinary fruitfulness.
Yes.
And with grandparents, hope is a certainty.
Yes.
An absolute certainty. I think that one of the thing that we try to emphasize was to listen. Pope Francis told us to listen.
That.
And the last message he ever sent, Joan, you may know it well. He was sitting in his wheelchair, and he, in a weak, quavery voice, he said to everybody, listen. When you're having a conversation with somebody, listen. He said, look at people when you're speaking. They can't wait to butt in. They're not listening. And he said to the grandchildren, above all, listen to your grandparents. Listen to your grandparents. And that, I believe, was his last message. And it was very interesting that through a papal see that had focused and highlighted the role of grandparents has been so vital in the church, that his last message to the elderly and to the young was to the grandparents, to keep the dialogue going.
You're so right. I was going to bring that up, but you preceded me, because if you were to go out and Google how many times did Pope Francis speak to the young people about their grandparents and have that dialogue, be with them, listen to them, we'd be very rich if we had €1 for just every time.
And for grandparents to tell their story, too, that's very, very important.
Oh, absolutely, because you're looking at an entirely different age. I mean, because grandparents can be young or they can be older. That also is a fact. But you've got someone, I think of my own grandparents, and it was fascinating to sit down and talk with them and find out what they wore to school, what they got on Christmas Day. They didn't come from wealthy families. Sometimes Christmas Day was extra ice cream, extra fruit. Maybe if you were lucky and a little girl, you got a doll. You didn't get 26 different separately wrapped gifts like today. Were you close to your grandparents, Marilyn?
I was very close, especially to my grandmother. All 4 of my grandparents came from Poland, and my father's parents died when I was very young. But I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, and she actually is the one that taught me to pray. My mother taught me to clean. I always say I have an aunt who taught me to laugh, and my grandmother taught me to pray. So I would spend the night with her, and we would kneel beside the bed at night, and she would say the line from the Our Father in Polish, and I would repeat it in Polish. So I tell people I forgot the Polish a long time ago, but I remember those moments with her, and the moments with her rosary beads, and with her very worn Bible.
Sure.
So that's my roots, definitely.
You're right. The rosary beads, it was just like a piece of jewelry. You had it with you all the time.
Yes, and my grandfather walking because the men's group met before Mass early on Sunday morning. And sometimes I would go to a later Mass, even as a teenager, and I would see him walking back by himself, all dressed. He only had one suit, but in his blue suit, no matter the time of year, churching, and I would give him a ride back home from Mass. And my grandmother, as she got older, picking her up for Mass, and her holding my arm on the way to the church when it became harder and harder for her, but to the end, extremely faithful.
As a matter of fact, my maternal grandfather, I was 10 when he died, and it was only shortly before his death that I learned that I assumed he'd been Catholic all of his life. Mm-hmm. He was there at all the ceremonies, went to Mass every Sunday, contributed to their parish in a economically in a big way, or if there was other help needed. But I learned I had known he'd been baptized Lutheran, but 6 weeks before he died, he became a Catholic. And it had been something that my grandmother had a scapular that she placed on his mattress, and he never knew it. She was the one that changed. Well, yeah, because she changed the sheets, right?
Yeah,
so he never knew it. She prayed every day
of
their marriage, And there were relatives that didn't know he wasn't Catholic. Just that's how Catholic he was. So grandparents were often the ones, the parents being younger, being busy, maybe having jobs. Maybe the faith kind of slipped through the cracks.
Joan, I never knew. I knew my grandfather, and my grandfather also was a convert. But the interesting thing about him was he was a Presbyterian, and he married my grandmother, who had been in the convent training to be a nun, and she left the year before she was professed through ill health. And back in those days, they made a match for them. There was a match made, and it was certainly a match made in heaven. But it was extraordinary. I found out much later, through the gravestones, Joan, that his mother, Lucy, had become a convert at the age of 81, just before she died. So wow. I'm inspired by the grandparents that I didn't know, that I never knew,
sure,
what their lives were like. And I suppose my surrogate grandmother was my great-aunt, my grandmother's sister, Auntie Catherine, who I'm called after. But what strikes me now is, with this generation, is that we grandparents, we're the generation that remembers the Eucharist. We remember the Rosary. We remember the smell of incense. And we carry these treasures with us. It's so important to us that we can pass those treasures down to our grandchildren. We may have missed a generation, but I don't believe we have. I don't believe we have, because, the seeds we've sown have gone deep, deep, deep into the ground, Joan. And although we may never live to see them reap, they surely will.
Well, I could sense a lot
yes.
of that at the conference. Well, that's all the time we have today. But come back next week for part 2 of my conversation with Catherine Wiley and Marilyn Henry of the Catholic Grandparents Association, as we talk about the first international conference that CGA recently held outside of Rome in Rocca di Papa. Joining us will be Archbishop Gilbert Carcera of Lipa, the Philippines, who has established CGA throughout his country. I also interviewed Cardinal Wilfred Napier of South Africa, as you heard me say several times in part 1, but for reasons unknown to me and our technicians, the recording was distorted and unusable.
For more information on these stories, or to check out Joan's blog and to ask her a question, go to EWTN.com. That's EWTN.com. Thanks for listening to Vatican Insider on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.